Alright, welcome back to The Last Climb. In this episode, I'm covering Karens who arrived on K2, convinced they knew better than the guides, the conditions, and sometimes even the mountain itself, because why not? From a Karen who stepped off the protection line to save a few minutes, to a Karen who bypassed a safety hold and was buried by the very slope she'd been told to avoid. It was August 3rd. 2016 K2, sitting on the border between Pakistan and China. It's the second highest mountain on Earth, at 28,251 feet. And unlike Everest, there's no gentle ridge walk near the top. Every section of this mountain is technical, steep, and unforgiving. Lucina Penrose was 44, a corporate litigation attorney from Denver, Colorado. She had 6 years of serious climbing experience, a private coach, and successful ascents of Denali and Aconcagua. She arrived at K2 Base Camp with a personal porter, a separately hired base camp coordinator, and a printed summit itinerary she had drafted herself from online expedition reports. I was 4 K2 summits worth of experience from her assigned guide not quite enough to earn that trust without a second opinion from the internet? The first signs appeared at Camp 2 around 21,300 feet. After waiting about 20 minutes in a queue on the fixed rope, Lucina grew impatient and tried clipping around the climber ahead of her, insisting she hadn't paid to stand behind slower people. By the time the team reached Camp 3, her frustration had only grown. When expedition leaders coordinated the summit push departure order and placed her team second, Lucina spent much of the rest day arguing for a different position, convinced she deserved to go first. The push began at 1 a.m., clear sky, wind under 20 miles per hour, around negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. For the first 2 hours, she held her position and moved well. Above 25,500 feet, progress slowed to a near standstill as climbers negotiated a difficult stretch of mixed terrain. After only a few minutes of waiting, Lucina grew impatient. Convinced the others were moving too slowly, she unclipped from the fixed rope and started traversing around the bottleneck. Her guide warned her that leaving the line was dangerous. Lucina ignored him and continued forward, convinced she could pass safely on her own. I don't know whether to call that confidence or pure arrogance, but brushing off the person whose job is literally to keep you alive is a gamble I would never want to make on K2. The section was at roughly 26,100 feet, just below the traverse leading into the bottleneck, the most dangerous feature on K2. The fixed rope runs along a narrow ice shelf, maybe 18 inches wide, with a near vertical drop to the right. The climber she was passing was stationary, clipped in, waiting for the person above to clear a step. Lucina moved to the right of him, crampons on the outer edge of the shelf, completely unclipped, ice axe in her right hand, left hand loosely on the fixed rope for balance. The climber above cleared the step and started moving again. The climber directly in front of Lucina shifted forward to follow, a routine movement on the route. As he stepped up, his crampon scraped lightly across the icy shelf. That was enough. Lucina's left crampon lost purchase and she dropped to one knee. For a moment she held her position. Then her right crampon skated across a patch of wind-polished ice and she tipped sideways off the shelf. There was no scream. Only the sharp sound of metal scraping across ice, followed by silence. She fell roughly 200 feet before her body entered the couloir to the right of the fixed rope. The slope there runs at around 55 to 60 degrees. She was unclipped from everything. There was nothing to arrest the fall and nowhere for it to stop. Her guide descended to the last point where she'd been visible. There was a gouge in the ice where her crampon had slipped and a mark on the fixed rope where her glove had scraped across it. Several climbers had witnessed the fall, but nobody could safely reach her. The couloir dropped thousands of feet below. At 4:40 a.m., he radioed base camp. A search was organized at first light, but the terrain beneath the couloir was heavily crevassed and too dangerous to enter. No helicopter could operate at that altitude. There was no rescue to launch, only a recovery effort. Lucina's body was never recovered. Her GPS device, left in her Camp 3 tent, recorded her last known position at 26,088 feet. Her ice axe was later found below the fall site, and multiple witnesses confirmed what had happened. The official finding was accidental death after she unclipped from fixed protection while attempting to pass another climber on an exposed section of the route. For Lucina, impatience was fatal. For the next climber, the real danger was believing she was too determined to quit. It was July 22nd, 2014. K2 doesn't care what month it is. Above 26,247 feet, the body starts breaking down instead of adapting. The air contains only a fraction of the oxygen found at sea level, and when the brain doesn't get enough, the only real solution is to descend. Beatrice Kingsley was 51, a real estate developer from Scottsdale, Arizona. She had climbed Kilimanjaro and Elbrus and completed an Everest base camp trek, but she had never been above 23,000 feet. Her guide recognized the gap immediately and recommended, in writing, that she attempt a less technical 8,000-meter peak first. Beatrice declined. She had purchased the outfitter's most expensive package, private tent, dedicated guide, and supplemental oxygen above Camp 3, and she liked reminding people of it whenever things didn't go her way. The way she talked about it, I really think she thought the premium price tag came with the right for her to do things her way. The headache started at Camp 3, around 23,600 feet, the night before the push to Camp 4. Her guide monitored her through the evening, had her rest and drink. By morning, it hadn't shifted. He told her he wanted to hold at Camp 3 for 24 hours before moving higher. Beatrice refused. Other climbers were moving. She had paid for a summit attempt. A headache wasn't a reason to stop. He documented the refusal, and they moved. At Camp 4, at 26,000 feet, the headache was worse. More concerning to her guide was the way she was moving a slight lateral drift when she walked, subtle enough that she probably didn't notice it herself. He watched her cross the tent platform and saw her overcorrect her balance twice. He'd seen that before. It's a neurological sign, not a fatigue sign. The brain under pressure doesn't send clean signals to the legs. He told her they needed to descend not in the morning, not after a few hours of rest, but immediately. Beatrice refused. She insisted she was fine, said she hadn't come all this way just to turn around, and before long the conversation circled back to a familiar point: how much she had paid to be there. He radioed base camp. The response came back clear: descend immediately. Beatrice heard it from the tent entrance and told them both she wasn't going anywhere. Her guide administered supplemental oxygen and stayed with her through the night. It helped, but it couldn't stop the progression. High-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, causes the brain to swell from a lack of oxygen, and the only real treatment is descent. By midnight, Beatrice was repeating questions and couldn't remember the name of her outfitter. She was still awake and talking, but she was no longer fully aware of where she was or what was happening. This is exactly what I meant earlier. No amount of money, upgrades, or premium services can negotiate with altitude. Once it decides, you've gone too high. He radioed 2 climbers from a neighboring expedition and asked for help getting her down. They came. Getting Beatrice into her gear took over an hour. She wasn't resisting, she just didn't understand what was happening around her. She kept trying to lie back down. One person held her upright while the other worked her boot buckles. They started moving at 2:10 a.m. On the fixed rope, her guide controlled her movement with a short rope system. Within the first few hundred feet, her legs gave out twice, and the rope caught her both times. By 4 a.m., she had stopped responding to voice commands. Her guide and 2 nearby climbers clipped her into a rope drag system and began lowering her down the slope. She lost consciousness at 4:50 a.m. Still above Camp 3, a helicopter was requested at first light. Weather conditions prevented it from reaching above base camp. The ground team that had set out from below couldn't close the distance in time. Beatrice died at Camp 3 at approximately 2:30 p.m. on July 23rd. Her guide had first recommended descent the previous morning at Camp 3, nearly 31 hours before she died. The post-mortem confirmed severe cerebral edema. The supplemental oxygen had slowed the progression enough that she made it through the night. It just wasn't enough to change the outcome. See how far refusing to listen can take you? Yeah, this is what that looks like. The next climber was about to make a different kind of mistake. She didn't ignore her guide, she fired him. It was August 11th, 2017. The summit of K2 sits at 28,251 feet, but reaching it is only half the climb. More climbers die on the descent than on the way up. By then, they're exhausted, mentally drained, and trying to navigate terrain that looks completely different in reverse. Kathleen Remington was 38, a personal trainer and fitness content creator from Austin, Texas. She had climbed 2 guided peaks above 20,000 feet and completed a high-altitude training course the year before. Fitness was not a problem. The problem was that she believed physical preparation could compensate for a lack of high-altitude mountaineering experience. She had hired a guide, but she wasn't particularly interested in being guided. The friction started early. At Camp 2, she disagreed with his pacing. At Camp 3, she disagreed with his oxygen schedule. She filmed content between camps describing him as overly cautious, framing his experience as timidity. The footage was cued for upload no connectivity at altitude. The summit push began at 1:30 a.m. on August 11th. Conditions were manageable, and her guide set a pace appropriate for the altitude. Kathleen repeatedly pushed ahead. At 27,400 feet, just above the bottleneck, he set a hard turnaround time of 11 a.m. She told him she wasn't paying him to make decisions for her. They reached the summit at 12:40 p.m., more than an hour and a half past that deadline. While her guide watched a growing bank of clouds to the west, Kathleen spent 11 minutes on the summit. By the time they started descending, the weather was deteriorating fast. Around 27,100 feet, the route requires climbers to follow a traverse before dropping into the bottleneck. In clear weather, the turn is obvious. In a whiteout, it can disappear completely. Her guide knew this and told Kathleen to stay close. She replied that she could see the fixed rope and didn't need managing. Kathleen was moving about 25 feet ahead when she reached the Traverse Junction. Her guide called out for her to stop and wait, but the wind carried the sound away. By the time he reached the junction himself, she was gone. He searched for more than an hour, moving back and forth along the fixed rope, calling her name and scanning the slope below. Visibility had dropped to less than 60 feet, and there was no sign of her in any direction. Alone above the bottleneck, and with the weather continuing to worsen, he eventually marked the location with a wand, began his descent, and radioed base camp. Remember, this was the same guide she had spent the expedition arguing with. The same guide she insisted shouldn't be making decisions for her. She had missed the traverse completely. Instead of following the rope left, she had continued down the natural fall line, a broad snow face that diverges from the correct route by about 15 degrees. Gradual enough that you wouldn't notice it immediately. The slope ends on a wide shelf at roughly 26,700 feet with no fixed rope, no camp, and no recognizable feature to navigate from. Her crampon tracks in the snow showed she had descended about 400 feet on the wrong line before stopping. From there, the tracks moved back and forth across the shelf, someone searching for something familiar. Then they showed an attempt to climb back up, about 180 feet of upward movement, before stopping at a small rock outcropping. She wasn't completely unequipped, she still had her ice axe harness and summit gear. But for an unplanned night at 26,700, she had almost nothing. Half a liter of water, 2 energy gels, and no shelter. That night, temperatures at Camp 4 dropped to around negative 44 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill. The search team left Camp 4 at first light on August 12th and found her at 8:20 a.m. She was at the rock outcropping where her tracks ended, seated against the rock with her knees drawn up and her hands pulled inside her jacket. She hadn't moved from that position. The cause of death was hypothermia from overnight exposure at extreme altitude without shelter. The guide's search effort was reviewed and found consistent with protocol given the conditions. The case was ruled accidental. Of all the ways to go on that mountain, dying alone on a slope you weren't even supposed to be on is something else entirely. This next woman never got lost. She just argued herself into the ground before the death zone even started. It was July 28, 2017. K2 isn't defined by one difficult section. It's defined by accumulation. Every part of the climb takes something from you, and by the time you reach the death zone at 26,247 feet, the cost of everything below is already in your legs, lungs, and judgment. You reach the hardest part of the mountain with whatever you have left. Jacqueline Norwood was 47, an operations director for a hotel chain in Chicago, Illinois. She had already completed 2 8,000-meter summits and had the experience to be on K2. What set her apart wasn't overconfidence. It was an almost compulsive need to manage everything around her, even when the system was already working. By the time the summit push approached, she had spent much of the designated rest day debating plans instead of resting. She ate poorly, slept less than 3 hours, and started the most demanding part of the climb already carrying fatigue she didn't need. I don't think she realized that every bit of energy spent trying to manage the expedition was energy she wouldn't have later on when she actually needed it. The summit push began at 1 a.m. on July 28th. For the first few hours, Jacqueline moved well, technically clean, on the fixed ropes, pace acceptable. Her guide had started to think the pattern might not carry through to the upper mountain. At 25,000 feet, Jacqueline stopped and insisted the rope order needed to change because another climber was moving too slowly. Her guide told her to keep moving. She stood on the slope arguing for 22 minutes before finally continuing. At Camp 4, she decided the oxygen distribution plan needed to be reorganized. Her guide had already assigned bottles for the summit push and told her to leave them alone. She started rearranging them anyway. He stopped her and repacked everything according to the original plan. The argument cost another 40 minutes. She had been awake for over 20 hours at that point. She had eaten fewer than 600 calories since leaving Camp 3, and she was noticeably slower leaving Camp 4 than she had been arriving at it. The team entered the death zone at around 3:40 a.m. Above 26,247 feet, every step depends on the reserves you have left, and Jacqueline had already spent more of hers than she realized. Her guide noticed her pace slowing. Her steps grew shorter, her breathing more labored. It looked like fatigue at first, but something wasn't right. At roughly 27,000 feet, she stopped completely. Both hands were on the fixed rope, her head lowered. When her guide reached her, she looked up but didn't respond. He checked her oxygen system and found nothing wrong. She could still move her feet, but only when directed. Her guide managed her weight on the rope and called out each step. At 26,400 feet, she sat down on the slope. Not a fall, just a deliberate stop. He got her back on her feet, and a few minutes later she sat down again. This repeated several times over the next couple hundred feet of descent before she sat down at 26,100 feet and could no longer stand. Her legs had nothing left. He tried for 8 minutes. The 2 other clients reached his position about 25 minutes later, and the 3 of them began moving her on a rope system, 30 feet in 40 minutes. Every unnecessary ounce of effort from earlier in the expedition was now being paid back twice over. The irony is that the symptoms that she kept trying to fix were never the problem. At 26,000 feet, she lost consciousness. A rescue team from Camp 4 reached them at 8:40 a.m. 4 people moving an unconscious climber on that terrain is still slow. They reached Camp 4 at 11:20 a.m. A helicopter was requested. Weather allowed a flight to Camp 2, not Camp 4. They began a lower mountain evacuation. Jacqueline died between Camp 4 and Camp 3 at approximately 1:45 p.m. on July 28th. The post-incident review identified the cause of death as hypoxic cardiorespiratory failure at extreme altitude. The review also noted that her physical condition at the point she entered the death zone was significantly below what would be expected at that stage of the climb. The guide's radio logs documented the supply bag delay, the tent reorganization, the Camp 3 rest day, and the oxygen dispute at Camp 4. That's what 3 days of arguments costs you at 27,000 feet. Over on the eastern face, Felicity Corbett had a different problem. She found a faster route, took it without telling anyone, and walked straight into a rockfall. It was August 7th, 2013. Between Base Camp and Camp 2, K2 can feel deceptively manageable. The air is still breathable, the terrain less technical. What catches climbers off guard is the rock. Years of freeze-thaw cycles leave sections unstable, which is why guides prefer moving through them early in the morning before the sun starts loosening things up. Felicity Corbett was 42, a competitive trail runner and amateur mountaineer from Boulder, Colorado. Technical alpine routes in the Rockies and the Alps, won 8,000-meter summit the previous year. She was fast and fit and had spent most of her climbing career being the strongest person on whatever route she was on. At base camp, she had clocked the second commercial team on the first day. Their size, their pace, their summit strategy. She started timing her own movements against theirs before the approach was even finished. By Camp 1, it was already affecting her decisions. She pushed her guide to leave earlier than planned on 2 separate mornings, not because conditions required it, but because the second team was moving. He adjusted once and held firm the second time.
It's clear that she was not trying to beat K2. Rather, she was trying to beat the people on it.
At around 21,000 feet, Felicity learned that another team was using a variation off the standard Abruzzi spur that could save roughly 45 minutes. She immediately wanted to take it. Her guide refused. He had seen rockfall on that section before, and another team had reported a rockfall event there less than a week earlier. He told her they were staying on the standard route. She argued the point for nearly an hour, but his answer didn't change. When they reached the junction, marked by a faded cord tied to a rock, Felicity unclipped and headed onto the variation anyway. Her guide told her to stop. She said she'd meet him at Camp 2 and continued alone. It was around 9:45 a.m. when she entered the variation. The sun had already been on the rock face for hours. About 340 feet into the route, a block of rock broke free roughly 180 feet above her. There was no warning, no crack, no shifting sound.
One moment the rock was in place, and the next it was falling. The extra 45 minutes she was trying to save ended up being the most expensive 45 minutes of the expedition.
The block was estimated to weigh between 60 and 80 pounds. After falling 180 feet, that was more than enough. It caught her on the upper left shoulder and the left side of her helmet. The force of the impact knocked her sideways off the route. She fell roughly 60 feet before the fixed line on the variation caught her, and she came to a stop hanging on the rope, completely unresponsive. A climber from the second commercial team, positioned about 200 feet above her on the same variation, had seen her go down. He descended to her position immediately. She was breathing, but unconscious. There was significant trauma to the left shoulder and upper chest. The left side of her helmet had visibly deformed on impact. He radioed his team leader. The call reached base camp at 11:05 a.m. Felicity's guide descended from Camp 2 the moment he received the relay and reached her position at around 12:30 p.m. By then, her breathing had become irregular. The rescue team from base camp arrived at the variation route at approximately 2:15 p.m. Moving an unconscious climber down a technical rock band requires a full lowering system and takes time regardless of how many people are working it. She reached the base of the rock band at around 5 p.m. She had not regained consciousness at any point during the evacuation. Felicity died at the base of the rock band at approximately 5:40 p.m. The post-mortem determined that blunt force trauma to the head and upper body caused her death. Rock analysis later confirmed thermal expansion activity on that section of the face, consistent with several hours of solar heating. The second team's lead guide stated that he considered the variation safe only before 9 a.m. After that, the rockfall risk became too unpredictable. Felicity entered the variation at approximately 9:45 a.m. Her guide's refusal and her decision to proceed alone were documented in his radio log and confirmed by 2 other climbers. The death was ruled accidental. Up on the northwestern face, the last woman on this list had plenty of warnings. She just had a reason for every single one of them not to apply to her. It was July 14th, 2014. Above Camp 3, K2's snowfields can look solid from a distance. What they don't reveal is the layering underneath. Wind deposits fresh snow over older snow, and if those layers fail to bond properly, a slope that appears stable can suddenly give way beneath a climber. Tabitha Sterling was 35, a women's outdoor advocacy blogger from Portland, Oregon. She had climbed 2 peaks above 20,000 feet and was physically capable of being on K2. Long before the expedition began, she had framed the climb as a public statement, writing that women were more disciplined, more risk-aware, and better decision-makers in extreme environments. She had built an audience around that idea. The expedition was supposed to prove it.
Can you imagine carrying that expectation onto a mountain like this?
The expedition reached Camp 3 on July 13th. Overnight, about 8 inches of fresh snow fell on the upper mountain. By morning, guides from multiple expeditions had reached the same conclusion. The new snow hadn't bonded properly, and the slopes above Camp 3 were unsafe. A 24-hour hold was called. 2 highly experienced climbers from another team immediately turned around and headed for base camp. Tabitha dismissed them as overly cautious.
When her guide demonstrated the weak layer between the surface snow and explained the risk, she insisted that the danger was being exaggerated. Wow!
He refused to take her above Camp 3. Tabitha said she'd go without him. He warned that if she left camp alone, he would report it to base camp. She dropped the argument and returned to her tent. At 4:50 a.m. on July 14th, before her guide was awake, she packed her gear, clipped into the fixed rope above camp, and started climbing alone. When he discovered she was gone, he immediately followed. Around 5:40 a.m., at roughly 24,600 feet, Tabitha moved off the fixed rope while crossing a wind-loaded bowl. The reason isn't known. Minutes later, a slab, approximately 180 feet wide, fractured about 40 feet above her. The snow released as a single unit before breaking apart into a fast-moving mass of snow and ice. She was struck from behind and above. The slab was already moving at speed when it reached her. There was no warning and no time to react. She went down with it and was carried approximately 800 feet before the slide stopped on a flatter section below the bowl. Her guide was ascending the fixed rope about 300 feet below her when the fracture released. He pressed himself against the slope and clipped both hands to the rope. The outer edge of the slide passed within 20 feet of him. When the snow stopped moving, the slope above him was empty and silent. He began probing the debris field immediately with his ice axe, working methodically across the slope. The snow was heavily compacted, and the axe rarely penetrated more than 2 feet before hitting resistance. He radioed base camp at 5:47 a.m. and continued searching. 47 minutes later, he located Tabitha buried about 4 feet beneath the surface, face down with her arms at her sides. He started digging with his hands and ice axe, but it took another 22 minutes to reach her airway. By then, she was not breathing and had no pulse.
And this is exactly why the guides called the hold. The goal was never to survive an avalanche, it was to avoid triggering one in the first place.
A second guide from Camp 3 reached the scene at around 7:10 a.m., and they worked on resuscitation together for approximately 20 minutes. A rescue team had been ascending from base camp since the 5:47 a.m. call, but the distance meant they couldn't reach the debris field in under 4 hours. By the time they arrived, the resuscitation attempt had already ended. Her body was recovered from the debris field and brought to Camp 3, then evacuated to base camp over 2 days. Her satellite communicator logged her departure from Camp 3 at 4:52 a.m., and her last recorded position at 24,588 feet at 5:39 a.m., 1 minute before the estimated avalanche release. Her camera was recovered from the debris field. The last image timestamped at 5:31 a.m. Her avalanche beacon was recovered from the debris. It had never been switched on. Snow analysis confirmed a weak layer slab release, consistent with the instability her guide had demonstrated the afternoon before. The guides from all 3 expeditions, along with the 2 climbers who had descended to base camp, provided statements corroborating the hold recommendation and the conditions on the slope. The death was ruled accidental.